He was the top student, the pride of his school, until one morning he was expelled without warning. No proof, no explanation. The next day, a billionaire's helicopter landed in the schoolyard. What happened next shook the entire town and exposed a secret buried for generations. They say the truth will set you free, but in Oak Ridge, Georgia, truth gets you expelled. The expulsion letter was printed on crisp ivory cardstock. No smudges, no corrections, just one line bolded in thick black ink. You are hereby dismissed from Oak Ridge Preparatory Academy due to academic dishonesty. Jalen Rivers stared at the paper, hands trembling, heart pounding like thunder trapped in his chest. He hadn't cheated. He didn't need to. His GPA was a perfect 4.0. His name was etched onto every honor roll since freshman year. His locker didn't hold contraband, only his books, his notes, and one battered photograph of his grandfather Ezekiel standing beside a rusted plow. The accusation was absurd, but the way Principal Emmett Bradford stared at him from behind his mahogany desk, eyes cold and void of doubt, made one thing terrifyingly clear. This wasn't a mistake. This was a message, and Jalen was the example. If you think this story is just about a smart black kid getting expelled, you're not even close. This is about land, power, legacy, and what happens when you dare to shine in a system built to dim your light. It's about the fire they thought would burn him, and the seed it awakened instead. Stick around, because the next 20 minutes will take you deeper than you're ready for. And once you start, you won't want to stop until justice stands at your doorstep. If you're feeling that chill down your spine already, go ahead and subscribe to this channel. It's how we keep these stories alive and how we keep telling the ones others try to bury. Now, let's go back. Before the lie, before the letter, before the fire. To the morning that started it all. The sun had barely risen over the pine trees when Jalen stepped outside, the Georgia humidity already clinging to his skin. He straightened his tie in the mirror of his father's old Ford pickup, took a deep breath, and tucked his debate notes into his backpack. Today wasn't just another school day. Today was the state regional debate finals. For most students at Oak Ridge Prep, debates were an academic exercise. For Jalen, it was a lifeline. He needed to win, not for a medal, not for a trophy, but to secure the attention of college recruiters who might just see past his zip code and into his potential. His father, Calvin Rivers, watched from the porch, a cup of black coffee in hand, his silhouette etched against the creaking bones of the old farmhouse. Land that had been in the Rivers' name for 3 generations stretched behind him, soil hard-earned and hard-kept, in a town that never stopped looking for a reason to take it back. "You ready?" Calvin asked. Jalen gave him a small smile. "Born ready." Calvin reached out and handed him something. A folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. Jalen knew it well. It was the same paper his grandfather had given to his father before his first job interview at the city mill. The same quote still etched in ink across the creases. "The world won't give you anything, son. You have to take it, with dignity." Oak Ridge Prep was an elite institution. Polished limestone buildings, digital projectors in every room, and a headmaster's portrait hanging next to the American flag in every hallway. Jalen was one of only 4 black students in the senior class, the only one on the debate team. But none of that mattered today. He was focused, calm, ready, until he saw Chase Bradford. Chase, the principal's nephew, stood near the judge's table, smirking in his tailored blazer. He didn't need to win to impress college scouts. His last name already did the heavy lifting. As they approached the podiums, Chase leaned in and whispered, "When this is over, don't take it personally. You don't belong here, farm boy." Jalen didn't flinch, didn't reply. His silence wasn't surrender. It was the sound of a storm gathering momentum. The topic was brutal. Should standardized testing be removed from college admissions? Chase argued in favor of keeping it, rattling off phrases like meritocracy, measurable achievement, and academic standards. His voice was slick, his tone rehearsed. Then it was Jalen's turn. He didn't shout, he didn't slam the podium. He started with a story. When I was 12, I had to share a math book with two classmates. We took turns copying equations onto paper bags because our school couldn't afford enough supplies. The day I took the PSAT, the power went out in our neighborhood. I studied by candlelight. I still got the highest score in my county, not because of the test, but in spite of it. He looked the judges in the eye, then turned to the audience. Standardized tests don't measure intelligence, they measure privilege. And if we're serious about equity, we have to stop pretending the playing field was ever level. Silence filled the auditorium. Then came the applause. Unanimous decision. Jalen Rivers, winner. When Jalen stepped off that stage, his heart wasn't just full, it was on fire. He knew what that victory meant, not just for him, for his family, for every kid who'd ever been told they weren't Oak Ridge material. Back home, Calvin grilled ribs and Ms. Mercer, his English teacher and debate coach, dropped by with a bottle of sparkling cider and tears in her eyes. "You didn't just win," she said. "You cracked something open. People saw it. They felt it." But across town, in a paneled office lined with awards and real estate portfolios, Principal Bradford sat with his brother, the same man who chaired the Savannah County Development Commission, and slammed his fist on the desk. "He humiliated my nephew," Bradford said. "Then make him disappear," his brother replied. The next morning, Jalen was summoned to the office. He expected praise. Instead, Bradford handed him a manila folder. Inside was a copy of next week's history exam. "It was found in your locker," Bradford said. "We have a zero-tolerance policy for cheating." Jalen blinked. "Sir, I don't even take history this semester." Bradford's gaze didn't shift. "You're expelled. Effective immediately." Jalen looked around the office. Same trophies, same certificates, same smug smile. Everything felt surreal, like a slow-motion car crash. "I want to speak to the school board," he said. "You'll find they're quite busy," Bradford replied smoothly. He was escorted off campus by security before noon. Outside, the air was thick with heat. His classmates whispered. Some stared. A few looked away. Ms. Mercer found him in the parking lot, his backpack slung low, his shoulders even lower. "This isn't right," she whispered. "I know you didn't do this." "It doesn't matter," Jalen replied bitterly. "It only matters what they can make people believe." Ms. Mercer's jaw tightened. "Then we'll show them the truth." Back at the farm, Calvin was already on the phone with a lawyer, but even as the fight began, another storm was brewing. Because later that week, when Riley poked around the school server after hours, he found something strange. A file labeled Special Students, Password Protected, created by someone with the initials EB. It was just the beginning. They thought they buried him. They didn't know he was a seed, and the roots were just beginning to break through the surface. If this first part of Jalen's story shook you, just wait until you hear what happens when a billionaire's helicopter lands at Oak Ridge High the very next morning. You do not want to miss what comes next. Hit that subscribe button now to support stories that matter and help us keep exposing the truth they try to bury. Comment challenge. Which quote best captures Jalen's spirit? A. The world won't give you anything. You have to take it with dignity. B. You don't belong here, farm boy. C. It doesn't matter what's true. It matters what they can make people believe. D. Standardized tests measure privilege, not potential. Drop your answer in the comments. Let's see who's really paying attention. The land had never been quiet, not really. Beneath the hum of summer cicadas and the occasional clatter of tractors in the distance, there was something deeper, older, woven into the soil. The Rivers family farm didn't just grow crops. It carried memory. Every blade of grass, every weathered fence post, had borne witness to generations of Black resilience. After the expulsion, Jalen Rivers stood at the edge of the property line as evening fell, the wind tugging at his hoodie, his jaw clenched tight. The sunrise had greeted him with purpose that morning. Now, the stars above felt like they were watching a boy already written off by the system. Just yesterday, he'd been a rising star. Today, he was a cautionary tale. He still hadn't told his mother. She'd passed when he was 11, but he talked to her sometimes in moments like these, in the quiet. He imagined her whispering, "Don't fold, not now." Back inside the farmhouse, Calvin Rivers sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by paper trails, receipts, property tax confirmations, land deed renewals, each one a shield against what he feared was coming. He was a man not easily rattled, but something about this felt different. This wasn't just about his son's reputation. It felt like a chess piece had been moved, a move designed to break their family in two. "Do you remember when they tried to take the North Acres back in '09? Calvin asked, voice low. Jalen nodded. "You fought 'em, took 'em to court, and won," Calvin added, tapping the table for emphasis. "But it cost us almost everything. They bank on us not having the time, the money, or the backing. That's how they win, quietly." Jalen looked down at the creased expulsion notice beside the property maps. "You think this is about the land?" "I think it always is," Calvin said, his voice grave. "You embarrass them. And we sit on 40 prime acres of riverfront land that Hollow Creek developers has been drooling over for years. What you did just gave them an excuse." That night, the barn lights stayed on late. Jalen helped his father fix one of the irrigation pipes, but his mind wasn't on the water pressure or the rusted bolts. It was on the look Principal Bradford gave him, clean, smug, calculated. Like this wasn't personal, just a matter of routine. Like Jalen was just another folder in a filing cabinet labeled "Problem Solved." The next day, Ms. Lynn Mercer showed up at the farm, her car kicking up gravel in the drive. She hadn't worn makeup and her eyes were tired, but there was a fire in her posture. "I've been digging," she said without pleasantries. "The school's surveillance system. Bradford said it was down that night, but I checked with maintenance. It was up. And someone deleted footage from that evening." Calvin leaned forward. "Can you recover it?" "Maybe, but that's not all." She pulled out a tablet and handed it to Jalen. "Look at this." It was a spreadsheet. Oak Ridge student expulsions going back 5 years. Names, dates, infractions, and a column labeled "Parent Occupation." There was a chilling pattern. A disproportionate number of expelled students were Black or Hispanic, and most came from families who own property near developing zones. "They're targeting the kids," Ms. Mercer said, "to get to the land." It was no longer a suspicion, it was a blueprint. Riley Monroe joined them later that evening, laptop tucked under one arm. "I started mapping it," he said, booting up his screen. "See this?" He pointed to clusters of red pins on a digital map. "All these are student expulsions. And this," he dragged his cursor to show overlapping blue lines, "is the Hollow Creek acquisition path." Jalen leaned over his shoulder. "They're building a corridor." "Exactly," Riley said. "From here to the Tybee coastline, and your family's land, smack in the middle." For a moment, no one spoke. The realization settled like heavy fog. This wasn't just about humiliation or even revenge. It was about a land grab disguised as educational discipline, a war dressed in policy and paperwork. Later that week, a woman in a luxury sedan parked just beyond the fence line. She didn't approach the house. Instead, she sent a man in a tailored suit who introduced himself as representing Hollow Creek developers. "We'd like to make an offer on your land," he said with a polished smile. "A very generous one." "It's not for sale," Calvin said, standing tall. "I understand," the man replied, unfazed. "But in light of your son's recent academic issues, We thought perhaps it might be an opportune time to consider your options. Legal expenses can add up quickly. We'd hate for that burden to affect your family's stability." Calvin didn't blink. "You're threatening my family's future in broad daylight, on my land." The man merely offered a card, nodded, and walked away. The next morning, the barn was vandalized. Red spray paint screamed across the wall. "You're next." They called the sheriff, who arrived 2 hours later and left 10 minutes after that. "Could be kids," he muttered. "Teenagers with too much time." But Jalen noticed how the deputy didn't take photos, didn't ask questions, just scribbled on a pad and walked away. That night, Calvin stood in the field under the stars. Jalen joined him in silence, both men looking out over the soil their ancestors had bled into. "Your grandfather used to stand right here," Calvin said. "When they took the east parcel from him, he didn't sleep for a week, but he never left. He just worked the land he had harder. That's the kind of blood you've got in you." Jalen swallowed. "But if they take this too, what are we then?" "We are not the land," Calvin said, voice like stone, "but the land is us. And when they try to uproot us, we don't scatter, we root deeper." The next day, Ms. Mercer called in a favor with a retired tech administrator from Oak Ridge. With his help, she recovered partial surveillance data from the night before the expulsion. The footage was grainy but clear. Chase Bradford, along with two other students, entering the school after hours using a staff key card. They were seen near Jalen's locker. It was enough to raise serious questions, but not enough yet to reverse the damage. Oak Ridge's administration had already pushed through the expulsion paperwork. The local press hadn't picked up the story, and the Hollow Creek offer had quietly been increased by 30%. They were tightening the noose, but they had underestimated something fundamental. The Rivers family had been underestimated before. So had Ms. Mercer. So had students like Jalen across the South for generations. But a seed planted in defiance grows with a vengeance. At night, the farmhouse buzzed with new energy, part strategy war room, part safe house. Riley compiled digital evidence while Jalen wrote out timelines and narratives for media submission. Ms. Mercer called in every favor she had in academia and education reform circles. Calvin documented every interaction, every threat, every deed. The mood shifted from fear to focus. And Jalen, once reeling from betrayal, now began to find a voice not just rooted in debate, but in truth. "Let them come," Calvin said one night, staring out into the dark. "They've got machines and money. We've got memory. We've got history. And we've got each other." And somewhere in the distance, beneath the soil they tried to take, roots grew thicker. The storm had begun, but so had the resistance. The morning after the barn was vandalized, the air around the river's property felt different, not just heavy with Georgia humidity, but with tension, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Calvin sat at the breakfast table sipping his coffee in silence, while Jalen stared out the window, watching a hawk trace lazy circles across the sky. They hadn't spoken much that morning. There wasn't anything left to say that hadn't already been said. The fight was on. They were outnumbered, outfunded, and under attack. The only question was how long they could hold out. So when the rumble of blades cut through the morning calm, both men stood instinctively. A helicopter, jet black and sleek, descended from the clouds above like a predator. It circled once before settling down in the wide-open field behind the house, sending plumes of red dust and pollen flying in every direction. Jalen shielded his eyes, stunned. Calvin stepped forward slowly, jaw tight, as the chopper's door opened and a tall man in a tailored gray suit emerged. He wasn't from around here. That was obvious from the cut of his clothes, the city polish on his shoes. But when he removed his sunglasses, his expression wasn't arrogant. It was reverent. "Mr. Rivers?" the man called out over the fading roar of the blades. "Calvin Rivers?" Calvin nodded cautiously. motioning for Jalen to stay close. "Who's asking?" The man stepped forward and extended a hand. "Julian Blackwell. I believe I owe your family a debt." Julian Blackwell. The name wasn't unfamiliar. A venture capitalist, tech mogul, and philanthropist, Blackwell had been on the cover of Forbes and profiled in every major business magazine. But what was a billionaire doing here? On a patch of soil most developers didn't even bother to find on the map without a GPS? "I think we should talk," Julian said. "Inside, if that's all right." Inside the house, the contrast was stark. The Rivers kitchen was humble, full of mismatched plates, worn chairs, and an ever-present smell of cornbread and earth. Blackwell, by contrast, looked like he belonged in boardrooms and high-rises. But as he sat across from Calvin, something softened in him. He pulled out a photograph, yellowed at the edges, and slid it across the table. It was of two young men in military uniforms. One was Blackwell, decades younger, a fresh-faced lieutenant. The other was unmistakably Ezekiel Rivers, Calvin's father, tall, proud, broad-shouldered, with the same steely eyes Calvin had passed down to Jalen. "Vietnam, 1972, Julian said. "Your father pulled me out of a burning convoy. I was 19, green as they come. I wouldn't be sitting here if he hadn't thrown himself on top of me when the second blast hit." Calvin stared at the photo for a long time. He never talked about that. He wouldn't have. "Ezekiel didn't want anything from me. I tried to help him after we came home, offered him money, connections. He refused every time. Said he didn't save me for a reward, said his only repayment would be watching his family grow strong." Julian looked directly at Jalen now. "When I heard what happened at Oak Ridge Prep," he continued, "when I saw the expulsion, your name, Rivers, I started digging. I saw the footage, the missing files, the sudden land interest. I knew this wasn't just a coincidence. This was a hit, and I wasn't going to sit back and let it happen." Jalen didn't speak. His mind was still reeling. It wasn't every day a billionaire landed in your backyard, especially not one who came bearing justice. "I'm not here to buy you out or make a press statement," Julian said. "I'm here to fight, whatever you need. Lawyers, investigators, media exposure. I've got it. Your grandfather saved my life. Maybe now I can do something that honors his." Calvin studied the man carefully. "This is dangerous. These people don't fight fair." "I don't either," Julian replied. They shook hands, and the fight became a war. The very next day, Julian returned with a team, lawyers, digital forensic experts, and a woman named Alana, who'd once worked in counterintelligence and now specialized in corruption investigations. Riley's eyes went wide with admiration. "Y'all are like the Avengers," he muttered under his breath. While the lawyers began compiling documentation to challenge Jalen's expulsion, Alana and Riley dug into the data trails, deleted files, altered student records, property deeds connected to Hollow Creek developers. What they found went deeper than anyone imagined. There was a hidden network. Dozens of expulsions, almost exclusively black and brown students, had preceded development offers on family properties. Most of those offers came from subsidiaries of Hollow Creek. A few even came from companies listed under different names, but with the same business registration address in Atlanta. Worse, Principal Emmett Bradford's brother was listed on the board of one such company. Another school board member was listed as a part-time consultant for Hollow Creek's Urban Revitalization Initiative. Jalen sat in stunned silence as Alana scrolled through the evidence. "They've been rigging the system for years," she said. "And your expulsion? It was just another piece in a very old puzzle." Meanwhile, Ms. Mercer was working her own angle. She reached out to former students, fellow teachers, and community leaders. Some had suspected the expulsions were part of a bigger pattern, but no one had dared speak up. Until now. One afternoon, a man named Leroy Daniels, once a star athlete at Oak Ridge, now working at a car lot, showed up at the farm with a folder. They kicked me out my senior year, he said. Said I plagiarized a paper. I didn't. But after that, my mama got served with a foreclosure. It never felt right. I just didn't have the proof. Now he did. With Alana's help, they were connecting dots others had been forced to ignore. Julian's media team crafted a dossier of evidence to be presented to the local press and, if needed, national outlets. But Julian wanted something bigger, something public, undeniable, impossible to bury. We're going to hold a town hall, he said, at the Civic Center. I'll fund it. We'll invite every news outlet, every community member, and we'll tell the story, your story, the way it needs to be told. But Calvin hesitated. They won't take this lying down. If we do this, we make ourselves targets. We already are, Jalen said quietly. The announcement of the town hall sent ripples through Savannah. Flyers went up. Hashtags started trending. The whispers that had long haunted the margins of the town were now at the center, and Hollow Creek developers started getting nervous. So did Principal Bradford. 2 days before the event, Jalen received a letter from the state university he had applied to. His application had been deferred due to concerns raised by Oak Ridge administration. The message was clear. This wasn't just about land anymore. It was about erasing his future. Jalen sat on the porch steps, letter in hand, fury burning in his chest. They want me to feel small, he said to Calvin. They want me to shrink. You don't bend, remember? Calvin said, sitting beside him. You root deeper. Julian sat with them that night as fireflies blinked lazily in the distance. I've spent my whole life chasing numbers, he said. But what I learned from your grandfather, what I'm learning again now, is that legacy isn't in what you build. It's in what you protect. He turned to Jalen. They're trying to bury you, but that just tells me you're getting close to the truth. Jalen nodded. He could feel it too. The tremble in the air, the shift in the wind. At dawn the next morning, the sun rose over the river's farm, casting long shadows on soil once soaked in sweat, sacrifice, and survival. The land was quiet again, but no longer passive, no longer cornered. The man who had once been saved in a war was now helping to fight another one, and the boy they tried to break had found not just his voice, but an army behind it. The night before the town hall, the Rivers farmhouse was restless. Outside, cicadas buzzed in waves, as if echoing the energy building inside. Julian Blackwell paced the living room with a phone to his ear, his voice clipped and urgent. Riley sat at the kitchen table surrounded by monitors, typing furiously, code flickering across the screen. Miss Mercer was at the stove, absent-mindedly stirring a pot of coffee while sorting through paper documents, her sleeves rolled to the elbows, her face carved with determination. Jalen stood in the hallway, looking out the front door toward the horizon. A low breeze rustled the leaves in the pecan trees. The barn still bore scars from the vandalism, its red paint marred with shadows of letters they had power washed away but never truly erased. He could feel the pressure building, the eyes watching, the weight of history curling around his name. For weeks now, they had uncovered truth after truth, connection after connection. Expulsions tied to land loss, memos between Hollow Creek executives, school board members with private shares in development companies. It all pointed to the same thing, a quiet, calculated displacement that masked itself in policy. But tonight, silence would end. The town hall was more than a presentation. It was a public act of reclamation. Jalen turned to his father, who stood nearby lacing up his boots. You still sure about this? Jalen asked. Calvin didn't answer immediately. He looked at his son, the lines around his eyes deep from years in the sun, and placed a hand on Jalen's shoulder. I've spent my whole life protecting this land, this family, he said. But protecting only gets you so far. Sometimes you have to step into the fire to keep it from spreading. So yes, I'm sure. They arrived at the Savannah Civic Center before dawn. The building, with its towering white columns and marble steps, had never seen anything quite like what was coming. Julian's team had transformed the main auditorium overnight. Projector screens flanked the stage. Sound systems had been tested 3 times, and live stream feeds were set up and secured on multiple platforms. By noon, the place was packed. Teachers, journalists, parents, students, local farmers. Even a few curious school board members sat in the back, arms folded, brows furrowed. And at the center of it all stood Jalen Rivers. He stepped up to the podium, microphone feeding his voice into every corner of the room and out into a digital world now paying attention. "My name is Jalen Rivers," he began, his voice calm, steady. "And 3 weeks ago, I was expelled from Oak Ridge Preparatory Academy. The official reason was cheating. But that's not what happened. And today we're going to tell the truth." Behind him, images and documents appeared on the screen. Surveillance footage of Chase Bradford entering the school after hours, records of altered grades, emails between school officials and Hollow Creek executives. "This isn't just about one student," he continued. "It's about a system, one that uses schools as weapons, one that pushes out students whose families own land that developers want, one that sells justice for a price and hides racism behind spreadsheets." Gasps echoed through the auditorium. Several parents stood, clutching each other's hands. Miss Mercer followed Jalen, walking the crowd through the school's expulsion records, showing how families were targeted just before receiving offers to buy their land. Riley presented a live digital map tracing Hollow Creek's acquisitions, each marked by a student's name and date of departure. But it was Julian who shifted the tone entirely. He stepped to the front, a figure of wealth and influence, and faced the crowd with a solemn expression. "I owe the Rivers family a debt," he said, "but I'm not here out of obligation. I'm here because what's happening in Savannah is happening across America. Wealth hiding behind institutions, power hiding behind education. And now, thanks to these students and this family, we have proof." He motioned to Alana, the investigator, who began playing a secret recording taken from a Hollow Creek planning meeting. On screen, the audience heard executives calmly discussing how to accelerate land buyouts by applying academic pressure on uncooperative households. Another voice, a school board member, mentioned Jalen by name. It was devastating, irrefutable. And still, Principal Emmett Bradford didn't flinch. He was standing near the exit, his arms crossed, jaw tight. When reporters tried to approach him, he offered nothing but a bitter smile. But then something no one expected happened. A young man burst through the side door of the auditorium, his face bruised, his shirt untucked. It was Brandon Bradford, Chase's younger brother. "I need to speak," he shouted, his voice cracking. "Please, you need to hear this." Security hesitated, unsure whether to let him through, but Jalen stepped back from the mic and nodded. "Let him speak." Brandon approached, visibly shaking. "My name is Brandon Bradford. I'm Principal Bradford's nephew," he said, the room growing pin-drop silent. "And I'm ashamed of what my family's done. I used to think this school existed to make people better, but it's not true. My uncle knew what Hollow Creek was doing. My father was one of the investors, and they didn't just target Jalen, they used me too." He pulled a flash drive from his pocket. "This is a recording. I took it 2 nights ago. My father didn't know I was listening. He talked about a final phase, about making sure Jalen's family didn't just lose the school, but the farm, everything." He turned to Jalen then, eyes filled with something halfway between apology and awe. "I'm sorry. I helped cover it up, but not anymore." The footage played. It was grainy, audio only, but the voices were clear. James Bradford, Emmett's brother, and several board members. They spoke of expediting tax charges, calling in favors, silencing teachers. "We'll get that land one way or another. It's worth too much. When the recording ended, the room didn't explode. It didn't even breathe. Jalen stepped back up to the mic. "Let me make something clear," he said. "We are not your stepping stones. We are not your charity projects. We are not your enemies. But we are also not for sale." He looked around the room, his gaze steady. This is where the line is drawn. The crowd erupted. Cheers, applause, tears. The truth had landed. But outside the Civic Center, darkness was already preparing its reply. That night, back at the farm, the air was still. Too still. Jalen sat on the porch watching the stars, exhaustion setting in. Calvin had gone inside to call their lawyer. Riley was asleep on the couch. Julian, for the first time since arriving, looked uncertain. Then, the explosion. The barn, rebuilt, repainted, repaired, lit up like a funeral pyre. Fire spread fast through the dry wood, black smoke curling into the sky. Jalen screamed for his father as they grabbed hoses, but it was too late. The blaze had been deliberate, controlled, devastating. The fire department arrived after 30 minutes. The sheriff followed. The report would later call it a case of suspected arson, likely unrelated. But they all knew the truth. Jalen stood in the field, soot on his face, heat still radiating from the wreckage. "They think this will scare us," he said. "It's not fear they're after," Julian replied. "It's silence." But the fire didn't silence them. It ignited something else. The very next morning, federal agents arrived at the river's property. The evidence from the town hall had reached the DOJ. A full investigation into Hollow Creek developers, the Oak Ridge School Board, and the Bradfords was officially underway. But retaliation came swiftly. That afternoon, Calvin Rivers was arrested. "Tax fraud," the officer said flatly. "Filed under county jurisdiction." The handcuffs clicked. The truck pulled away. And Jalen, standing in the dust where his father had just been taken, whispered something he barely heard himself. "They really think we'll fold." But the land does not fold. It roots deeper. The days following Calvin Rivers' arrest felt like living in the eye of a storm. There was no wind, no movement, just the heavy stillness before a second strike. Inside the farmhouse, the air was thick with anxiety. Ms. Mercer paced constantly, fielding calls from lawyers and education reform groups. Julian Blackwell's voice, usually composed, carried an edge of clipped frustration as he coordinated with federal contacts and investigative journalists. Riley barely left his laptop, sleep-deprived and manic, chasing every digital thread that could expose the network behind Hollow Creek. And Jalen, he was quiet, not from defeat, but from calculation. The fire had burned their barn down, the sheriff had taken his father, and yet he wasn't broken. He had seen too much now, understood too deeply. They had tried to remove his future from Oak Ridge. Then they tried to erase the past by targeting the land his ancestors had fought to keep. But they forgot one thing. Fire only consumes the surface, roots run deeper, and Jalen had finally found his. By the third day, the Justice Department moved fast. Brandon Bradford's testimony, along with the flash drives, hidden recordings, and Hollow Creek's internal files, triggered a nationwide investigation. Charges of fraud, racketeering, conspiracy, and civil rights violations were levied against James Bradford, Principal Emmett Bradford, and 4 members of the Oak Ridge School Board. Arrest warrants were issued. The story hit every major network. Cameras returned to Savannah, not for charity drives or election photo ops, but for accountability. The river's name was no longer whispered in shame. It was spoken with reverence. And yet, none of it brought Calvin home. Not yet. Julian's legal team fought to dismantle the false tax charges, uncovering that the financial evidence had been doctored using access from a corrupted local assessor's office, an office financially tied to Hollow Creek through a shell company. The judge, pressured by federal scrutiny and overwhelming public outcry, released Calvin Rivers on bail. When Jalen saw his father step out of the courthouse, the world stopped. They didn't speak at first. They just stood there, surrounded by reporters, lawyers, and flashbulbs, and embraced. "I told you," Calvin whispered, "they'd come hard." "You didn't tell me we'd still be standing," Jalen replied. Back at the farm, what remained of the barn was cleared. The ash was swept into respectful piles. Jalen watched the smoke rise again, less a symbol of destruction now and more of rebirth. They had survived the worst. Now it was time to build something lasting. Julian sat them down at the kitchen table that evening. An old blueprint rolled out in front of him. Not a business model, not a court document, but a vision. "I've been thinking," he said. "This land is sacred, not just for what it survived, but for what it can teach. I want to help you establish something here, a center for justice, for education, for every student and family who's ever been pushed aside like Jalen was." Jalen leaned forward. "Like a school?" Julian nodded. "And more. A foundation that defends rural black families, that documents land theft, that trains young people in civic engagement and community defense. This can be bigger than just Oak Ridge. It can be the first of many." Ms. Mercer, who had just walked in with a tray of tea, set it down slowly. "The Carter River Center for Rural Justice," she murmured. Calvin raised an eyebrow. "Why Carter?" Julian smiled. "Your father's legacy deserves to be remembered. He saved my life. And in a way, he's still saving people now." For the next month, the farm transformed. Volunteers came in droves. Former students, neighbors, lawyers, journalists, organizers. They painted, rebuilt, landscaped. The ground where the barn once stood became the site for a new learning hall. Desks, whiteboards, a media room. Ms. Mercer, officially cleared of any wrongdoing, accepted the role of academic director. Brandon Bradford, now estranged from his family and under protection, became an unlikely ally. He worked in silence most days, hands blistered, face weathered. He didn't ask for redemption. He earned it brick by brick. Meanwhile, Oak Ridge Prep was under state review. The Department of Education placed the school under emergency oversight. Teachers who had turned a blind eye faced administrative leave. Others, those who had quietly resisted, stepped into leadership roles. The first act of the new board was to expunge Jalen's expulsion from his record and issue a public apology. But Jalen declined to return. "Some doors don't need to be reopened," he said in an interview. "Some need to be torn down so others can walk through." He announced his decision to attend Morehouse College on a full scholarship, personally funded by the Blackwell Foundation, but not immediately. First, he wanted to spend a year building the center and laying the groundwork for its long-term mission. The boy they tried to push out of a classroom was now building one of his own. The grand opening of the Carter River Center for Rural Justice was held exactly 90 days after the town hall. A stage was set on the field where generations of Rivers had tilled soil. Community leaders, journalists, national figures, and even federal investigators came to witness the moment. Jalen took the stage to a standing ovation. "This place," he said, "was nearly taken. Not by a bulldozer, not by a court order, but by silence. Silence from those who benefit. Silence from those who fear. Silence from those who are simply tired of fighting." He paused, letting the air settle. "But we chose to speak, and that changed everything." He gestured behind him, to Ms. Mercer, to Julian, to Riley, to his father. "This land now belongs to every student who's been told they're too loud, too poor, too rural, too black. It belongs to every family whose land was taken with a smile and a lie, and it belongs to the memory of those who fought before we had the language to call it what it is." He looked out across the field. "They tried to burn this down, but you can't destroy what's rooted in truth. From ashes, we rose, and we are not going anywhere." The crowd erupted, tears flowing, fists raised. After the event, as dusk began to fall, Jalen walked out to the edge of the property. The rebuilt structures behind him stood strong. Children ran through the fields. The sun dipped behind the trees. Calvin joined him, hands in his pockets. "You've done good," he said. "We've done good," Jalen replied. For a while they said nothing. Then Jalen reached into his pocket and pulled out the same folded paper his father had given him the morning of the debate. The words were still there, the ink faded, but the message eternal. "The world won't give you anything, son. You have to take it, with dignity." Jalen smiled. "Guess it was never just about taking. It was about protecting." Calvin nodded, eyes glinting in the golden light. Exactly. That night, as the last volunteers left and the lights in the center flickered on, a stillness returned to the land. Not the stillness of fear, but the stillness of resolve, of purpose fulfilled. The river's legacy, once under threat, now pulsed with new life. And somewhere far away, in a federal detention center, Emmett Bradford sat watching the news coverage. The sound muted, the images crystal clear. The boy he tried to silence was now a symbol. The farm he tried to seize was now a sanctuary. The lie he built an empire on had become the truth that dismantled it. Justice didn't come all at once. It came like the seasons, slow, relentless, inevitable, and it had finally taken root. The days after the Carter River Center for Rural Justice opened were not marked by fanfare, but by something far more meaningful: movement. Not the kind that comes from the noise of headlines or national attention, but the quiet kind that settles into soil and routine. Every morning, young people from surrounding counties arrived at the center with notebooks in their hands and purpose in their hearts. They weren't just there to learn history, they were there to reclaim it. Jalen Rivers now walked the same fields his grandfather once plowed, not with a rake or a hoe, but with an iPad and curriculum plans. He had taken a deferment from Morehouse, not because he was uncertain of his future, but because the urgency of now could not be delayed. What started as a space for legal education had expanded into something deeper: agricultural sustainability, civic literacy, land preservation, storytelling. A new generation was being taught that their worth was not defined by tests or zip codes, but by the roots they chose to deepen. Every classroom at the center bore the name of someone who had resisted quietly in the shadows: an expelled student, a wrongly fired teacher, a dispossessed landowner. On the far wall of the main hall hung a massive mural painted by students, showing a tree growing from the cracked concrete of a school floor, its roots twisted through images of court documents, protest signs, and soil-stained hands. At the mural's base, Calvin Rivers stood watching one morning, arms folded, pride shining behind his quiet expression. He didn't speak much in meetings or lectures, but when he did, it was the kind of truth that landed heavy. "They thought our land was just dirt," he said to a group of visiting students. "But land is memory. It remembers who walked it, who fed it, who tried to steal it, and it remembers who took it back." The work wasn't easy. Opposition remained. Hollow Creek had filed for bankruptcy protection, and while the Justice Department had frozen their assets, smaller development firms had begun circling Savannah, hoping to pick up the pieces. Emmett Bradford, still awaiting sentencing, had filed multiple motions to overturn his charges. James Bradford was leveraging every political contact he had left, trying to smear the center's leadership as radical agitators. And then there were the threats. Late one evening, a package was left at the center's gate. Inside, a torn page from a school report card, soaked in red ink, with a single message: "We're not finished." It was Brandon who found it. He said nothing to anyone at first, simply sat in the library for hours afterward, eyes distant. When Jalen confronted him, Brandon finally spoke. "They'll never forgive me for speaking out," he said. "Not my family, not the people who stood with them. They see me as a traitor." You didn't betray them, Jalen said. You broke the chain. There's a difference. Brandon continued volunteering, continued working in silence, continued putting in more hours than anyone else. In the months that followed, the center gained national partners. Legal organizations contributed pro bono resources. Agricultural universities sent interns to learn and teach sustainable farming. The Southern Poverty Law Center published a report citing the center as a model for rural equity. And slowly, a movement began to form, one grounded not in spectacle, but in soil, sweat, and structure. Jalen was invited to Washington, D.C. to testify before a congressional subcommittee on educational inequality and generational land loss. He wore a simple black suit and carried a small piece of pecan bark from the farm in his pocket, like a talisman. When asked what justice meant to him, he didn't speak in abstractions. Justice, he said, is when no child has to choose between telling the truth and protecting their family's legacy. When a student can debate ideas without being erased. When land passed down through generations isn't treated as a commodity but as a covenant. Justice is rooted. It grows where others tried to bury it. His testimony sparked a federal review of school expulsions across southern states, revealing similar patterns in 3 additional counties. More centers were proposed, modeled after Carter Rivers, with Jalen consulting on their development. Back in Savannah, the center had expanded into a network of local farms, reviving community gardens in neighborhoods long neglected. Elder farmers came to teach, children came to plant. The land that was nearly stolen now fed the community. Miss Mercer, who had once doubted if she'd ever teach again, led seminars for aspiring teachers from underserved areas. One autumn afternoon, Jalen walked the field behind the center with his father. The trees were turning gold and red, the air cool and clean. This was supposed to be the end, Calvin said. You getting expelled, the fire, the charges, they wanted to finish us. Jalen smiled. They did finish something. They finished the lie. They stopped at the base of a tree, planted not long after the barn burned. It had grown fast, taller than expected, its roots thick and knotted. Funny thing about ashes, Calvin said, patting the trunk, they make good soil. Not long after, the Carter River Center announced its annual Youth Leadership Conference. Students from across the South applied, many of them from towns just like Oak Ridge, where silence had reigned for too long. Among the applicants was a young girl named Maya, who had been suspended for questioning a curriculum that erased Black history. Another, Marcus, had been homeless for most of his junior year and was now an advocate for student housing support. Jalen read every application personally. When the conference began, there were 50 students gathered beneath the same roof where just months ago their movement had been born. They told stories, shared strategies, and made vows, not just to fight, but to build. At the final session, Jalen stood in front of them and said, "This began with a lie, but it ends with you." He stepped back, and one by one, the students stood and spoke, not rehearsed, not prompted, but real. My voice matters. I am not disposable. We are not visitors to this land. We are its caretakers. The applause that followed didn't just fill the room. It echoed through the fields, the pastures, the gravel roads of Savannah, and beyond. Back at the farmhouse that evening, Jalen sat on the porch with Julian Blackwell, both men sipping sweet tea under the stars. The billionaire who had once arrived by helicopter now visited by car, his sleeves rolled up, his presence familiar. "You know," Julian said, "your grandfather once told me in Vietnam that the most dangerous thing in the world was a young man with nothing left to lose." Jalen looked out over the land. "And the most powerful thing is one who knows exactly what he's fighting for." Julian nodded. "Your grandfather would be proud." Jalen stood and walked to the edge of the porch. The center glowed in the distance. Children laughed by the learning garden. Somewhere inside, Riley was running a digital literacy workshop. Brandon was helping new students with registration, and Ms. Mercer was reviewing essays under the soft light of her desk lamp. Jalen closed his eyes. They tried to bury him. They didn't know he was a seed. And now, the forest was growing. From the moment Jalen Rivers stood on the steps of Oak Ridge Preparatory Academy, clutching the expulsion notice that tried to define him, his life took a turn not just for himself, but for an entire community whose voices had long been ignored. His story is not simply one of revenge or vindication, it is one of resurrection. A journey from being a victim of a rigged system to becoming an architect of lasting justice. His name may have begun as a whisper in dusty school hallways, but it now echoes across institutions and hearts alike as a symbol of truth, courage, and unshakable roots. What started with a rigged locker search turned into a revelation, a discovery that academic expulsion was merely the first domino in a chain reaction of generational land theft, systemic racism, and institutional abuse. And yet, instead of breaking under the weight of it, Jalen stood taller. Each injustice uncovered didn't push him down, it pulled him deeper into the legacy he was born from. This was never just about one student or one school. This was about the pattern how Black and brown students were systematically pushed out of schools to soften families for land acquisition, how developers worked hand in hand with school boards, how educators betrayed their purpose, and how silence became complicity. But Jalen refused to be silent. With the unwavering support of his father Calvin, the mentorship and protection of billionaire Julian Blackwell, a man indebted to the Rivers family legacy, and the fire of allies like Miss Lynn Mercer and Riley, Jalen found power in truth. He learned that storytelling, when backed by evidence and conviction, could become its own kind of justice. He held a mirror to a community that had convinced itself it was colorblind and forced it to confront its own reflection. Jalen didn't just fight back, he fought forward. Through public exposure, federal investigations, and local mobilization, what was once a small rebellion became a movement. The Carter River Center for Rural Justice wasn't just a building, it became a sanctuary, a battlefield, and a classroom all in one. It taught young people how to speak, how to resist, how to plant roots instead of waiting for permission to grow. Calvin Rivers, who had seen the land nearly taken from his family more than once, finally saw it become more than a farm. It became a legacy, and that legacy didn't come through money or recognition. It came through service, through standing firm when it would have been easier to sell, through telling his son time and time again, "We are not for sale." Julian Blackwell, once a boy saved in war by Ezekiel Rivers, had finally paid his debt, not in dollars, but in dignity. He leveraged his power to protect what many had chosen to ignore. He helped turn a single voice into a chorus and showed that redemption doesn't require guilt. It only requires action. And Ms. Mercer, who risked her career to do the right thing, proved that courage in the face of career-ending threats is one of the rarest forms of bravery. Her quiet rebellion, her relentless pursuit of truth, made her more than a teacher. She became a protector of the very concept of education. Brandon Bradford's journey is equally powerful. The nephew of the principal, the son of a corrupted man, Brandon had every reason to stay silent. But he chose betrayal over blind loyalty, and in doing so, saved not only himself, but helped expose the cancer festering within Oak Ridge. His redemption wasn't cinematic. It was real, raw, and painful. But it mattered. Through every act of resistance, Jalen remained grounded. Grounded not in anger, but in clarity. His vision for justice wasn't about revenge, it was about reconstruction. He understood what too many forget, that the most powerful change doesn't come from a courtroom victory or a viral headline. It comes when a child no longer has to fear being silenced. It comes when land, once taken, is restored. It comes when truth becomes undeniable. So what is the lesson we take from Jalen Rivers' journey? It's this. Injustice often hides in plain sight, cloaked in policy, dressed in professionalism, backed by institutions that pretend to serve but quietly destroy. But one determined voice rooted in truth and heritage, can unravel even the most entrenched systems. We live in a world where silence is often easier than resistance, where standing up means standing alone, where the price of truth can be careers, friends, or even safety. But if Jalen's story teaches us anything, it's that those who dare to speak, who dare to plant themselves like trees in storm winds, become the very foundation others build upon. Apply this in your life. Ask yourself, where have you seen injustice? In your workplace, your community, your schools? Have you witnessed someone silenced, erased, dismissed? What would happen if you chose not to look away? You don't have to lead a revolution to make a difference. You just have to speak, to act, to stand when sitting would be safer, to resist when silence would be more comfortable. Whether it's calling out unethical behavior at work, defending someone whose voice is ignored, or protecting traditions and lands passed through generations, your action, however small, ripples. And now, we turn the question to you. What part of Jalen's story resonated with you the most? Was it the moment he stood up to Principal Bradford? The town hall where the truth was finally exposed? The rebuilding of the barn from ash into legacy? Or was it something quieter, something that reminded you of a moment in your own life? We want to hear from you. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Let's talk. Let's learn from each other. Let's keep this story alive by turning it into a conversation that matters. And if this story moved you, even just a little, please consider subscribing to the channel. Every subscriber gives this work more reach, more power, and more motivation to keep going. We are a small but passionate team, and producing content like this takes heart, time, and yes, resources. If you believe in the value of stories like Jalen Rivers, we invite you to consider donating. Whether it's the cost of a coffee or something more, every contribution helps us continue shining light on hidden injustices and giving voice to stories that need to be told. The early days are the hardest, and your support will help us create more content that challenges, uplifts, and unites. Because somewhere right now, another Jalen is being told he doesn't belong. Let's make sure he knows he does. Thank you for listening, for caring, and for being part of this growing community. The roots are strong here, and with you, they'll only grow deeper.